Hello and welcome to Thoughts in the Green Room with your host, Geoff Mays. This week in the Green Room, I want to talk about acting classes. Acting classes I've heard everything about, from the good to the bad to the ugly. And this week, nothing profound. I simply want to take a little bit of time and discuss acting classes and what value or purpose they may serve, regardless of your opinion on them. So when I think about acting classes, I think about, and before I say that, I'm going to preface this with, when I think about acting classes in the past, I think what a waste of time, what a waste of energy, and what a waste of money. I've sat with my colleagues over the years and I've thought about the 3-hour length of time that I put in. And I'm like, wow, what a waste. There are so many other things I can do with those 3 hours. Then I think about the energy that I put out during those 3 hours and I think, oh, how draining, how dry, how blasé. And finally, I think, man, that's a lot of money to spend for those two negative outcomes. And as a result of this, I've never had a positive outlook on acting classes. Now, why specifically have I not had a positive outlook on acting classes? And that's simple. I go into the acting class with the attitude that I get 15 minutes with the instructor. I get a couple of notes from my scene, and then I sit down and I wait until the next week until I go up again to get 15 minutes and a couple of notes. Now, if I'm at the end of the class, I've got to sit through 2 or 3 hours of my colleagues before it gets to me. If I'm at the beginning of the class and I have to sit through 2 or 3 hours after I've done my work before I get to leave, and man, is that ever draining. And over the years, this mental attitude towards classes has meant that I take 1 or 2 sort of out of necessity, maybe to brush up on some skills, and then I shy away from classes for a long time, sometimes as much as 4 or 5 years. This, I admit cleanly and clearly, is not a good approach to acting classes, which is why I preface it with being in the past. During COVID, I wanted to be creative and I didn't know exactly how I was going to be creative. And a good friend of mine, Dave Walpole, encouraged me to take some classes with him because he was doing a number of classes. I was hesitant. And the first thing I thought about was that when COVID opens up and everybody goes back into auditions, maybe having the skills up and ready to go would be a very strong choice. And that brings me to my first point. Practice makes perfect. Now, this is a very age-old adage, but it is something that is true. The more you practice, the better you get. Some of you out there may have heard of the 10,000 rule, 10,000 hour rule, and for the life of me, I cannot remember the author of that rule. Feel free to Google it. And the author says in a nutshell that if you practice something for 10,000 hours, you reach a certain level of efficiency that is recognized. That's the nutshell. Feel free to Google it. The point being that practice enriches a skill. Now, this is a truth, so the more you practice, the better you get. That's the first thing that encouraged me to take classes with my friend. The second, of course, was my friend. Now, before I got into the classes with my friend, I voiced my issues and said, oh man, what a waste of time, what a waste of energy, what a waste of money. And he was like, no, you got to shift your perspective. You got to get more out of these because this is beneficial. In addition to the agreed upon practice makes perfect point, he helped me shift my idea about what a class is. The first value, you get 10 or 15 minutes of dedicated time with an instructor. And provided that instructor is good, and I will come back to that point about instructors being good, that feedback becomes valuable. Why can't I get that feedback from my sister, my partner, my mother, my father, my best friend? It's feedback. Here's the difference. Those people I just named are all people in my life, and they are not authorities on acting. They're just opinions. When I go to an acting class, I give authority to the person at the front of the room as an expert. And because I give them that authority, their feedback lands with greater power. Because I give them authority, I'm willing to receive that feedback and then incorporate it into my self-examination, my self-observation, and decide whether and how to apply that feedback so I can grow. My point being that I'm not resistant because of perspective. So the perspective on the person who gives me the feedback allows me to incorporate it greater because they are offering a class, they are seen as an expert. Perspective is important. Now, I said I'd come back to this point about the person in front of the room and if they're good. I believe that every person, barring the occasional few individuals who stand out as truly not effective in the way that they approach things, barring those few individuals, that every person who's offering some sort of class is good at what they do. Why? Not because they're necessarily good for me, but because they know what they're talking about. The key for them to become a great instructor or a great coach is for me to find somebody that I can relate to, somebody whose style of communication connects with me, somebody who I can hear and work with versus somebody that I don't trust. So my point is that everybody out there is good. You as the actor needs to simply find the person who you are able to receive the information from effectively. Once you've found that person or persons, I encourage you to stick with them because you've got a compatibility that allows information to go freely into you so you can grow. And this is why I say if they're good, meaning if you found the person you're willing to hear that translates the information for you. So once you've found that person, the acting class now can have value because you trust the person in the front of the room to give you feedback which you're willing to receive and you can receive so you can self-reflect and grow, adding to your practice, which makes things perfect. So far, so good. My perspective is starting to shift on acting classes. Now, the next thing was the time spent. If I go into class and I'm the first one up, I got all this time after. If I'm the last one up, I've got all this time before. But then Dave put forward the idea of what happens when I observe. When I was going to classes before, I was observing the class as my 15 minutes and then I'm done. Perspective shift. What if I'm the coach? What if I sit and observe actively rather than passively my colleagues who are up in front of the camera for the moment? And I give them notes, keeping them to my head because I'm not the instructor of the class, but keeping them in my head and giving them notes for myself or observing what they're doing and critiquing it, comparing what I would do in their shoes, choices I would make, so on and so on and so on. And then when the instructor offers feedback, compare what they've said to what I've said and see where that lands for me. See how that I would do things differently and find out what I'm getting out of it. My point being that active engagement, finding a way to put myself actively into the class, gave me opportunity to continue my growing even though I wasn't there. Now, I know this may seem like a very simple concept to so many people out there, but for me it was not. It was a shutdown, a resistance to something I wasn't enjoying, from maybe a bad class when I was younger, I'm not sure. From maybe a bad class when I was older, I'm not sure. For whatever reason, I had the wrong perspective for myself going into an acting class, and it has tainted my past with them. Coming through COVID and knowing that I needed something to help me be creative, and the influence of one of my friends has allowed me a new perspective. And that perspective on acting classes is, one, finding an instructor who I can relate to, who I can listen to, who I can actively give my trust to is going to help me grow. Two, that rather than sitting and waiting for my turn or finishing my turn and waiting for class to end, if I put myself in the place of the instructor and coach from the sidelines, again in my head, because I'm not the instructor for the class and I've got no right to coach anybody in that class, but keep it in my head and then do my comparisons with what the instructor says, I'm keeping myself engaged, and by engaging myself, I am actively learning, if you will, by osmosis through someone else. Learning from start of class to end of class. This all comes from a choice. Now, breaking through this barrier for me has been very important, and this, I guess, is why I've brought acting classes to the forefront. Over the years, I've spoke to many people who hold the same negative opinions that I have about acting classes. And To those people specifically, I say maybe it's time for a perspective shift so you can find value and help yourselves grow. For those of you who have never done classes or do them rarely or maybe just thinking about them at this point, I offer you the insight to having a positive perspective going in to help you stay engaged and to help you grow. And currently, during this season of COVID is what I'm going to call it right now, with production just beginning to open up, there are going to be a lot of opportunities offered to actors through auditions because everything's going and they're getting a lot of green lights. So what's it going to hurt you to have some extra practice to be ready for those auditions? Classes in the past for me were a negative. Classes now are a positive, and I gained that through perspective shift. The larger picture that I see right now in saying this to you about classes is what else do you hold in your life as a negative that if you could step back and shift your perspective, could you make into a positive, or at least something that doesn't drain you negatively? Those are your thoughts from the green room. I'm your host, Geoff Mays, and I'll see you in 1 or 2 weeks.